Welcome to Deep Dive. In this episode, we talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Loyal listeners will know my deep fascination with biblical documents and how they impact our current understanding of the religions that have come out of these ancient documents. We have 3 references for this episode, which you will see on screen.
Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine stumbling upon a library of scrolls. And they're not just old, they're older than any version of the Bible you've ever seen.
Yeah, texts that predate even the most ancient copies we knew about, like by centuries. It's pretty mind-blowing.
That's exactly the impact of the Dead Sea Scrolls discovery. Before them, our understanding of the Hebrew Bible, it really leaned heavily on manuscripts from the Middle Ages, right?
That's right. We had the Masoretic text, which is the standard Hebrew text. The Septuagint, that's the ancient Greek translation.
Yeah.
The LXX.
The LXX, yeah.
And the Samaritan Pentateuch. Those are kind of our 3 main pillars for the older Bible versions.
But the Dead Sea Scrolls, they just catapult us back, another 1,000 years? Giving us a much, much earlier glimpse.
And what's so fascinating is they give us this direct connection to the religious world, the textual world, of the Second Temple period, which was, a really dynamic time for Jewish thought.
Right. Before these scrolls turned up, our knowledge of that era mostly came through, like later rabbinic writings or the New Testament itself.
Exactly. And translations of the Hebrew Bible often relied on manuscripts, maybe a millennium younger than some of the stuff found at Qumran, where the scrolls were discovered.
So for this deep dive, we're really immersing ourselves in these ancient documents. We're looking specifically at what they tell us about Messianic expectations, hopes for a future deliverer.
And how they interpreted Scripture, and maybe a little bit about the community that actually produced and preserved these texts.
Yeah, exactly. And our guides for this are excerpts from Eschatology, Messianism, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible.
And these are great sources because you get both sides. There's the scholarly analysis, digging into the meaning and the history,
Right.
but also direct translations. So you can see the text yourself, often with notes comparing them to the later Bible versions we know.
Yeah. So our mission today is to really try and understand these key parts of ancient Jewish thought as the Dead Sea Scrolls show them. We want to see how they give us this unique window, offering crucial background for religious developments that came later.
Makes sense.
So where should we begin? The whole Messiah thing seems like a pretty big topic in the scrolls.
It definitely is a logical starting point. One really interesting area is how they interpreted Psalm 72 messianically. What stood out to you there?
Well, the source, Eschatology, Messianism, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, points out that even the Targum, that's the ancient Aramaic translation, explicitly reads Psalm 72 with a messianic angle. It mentions the King Messiah and the son of King David.
Right. And apparently that was the general rabbinic consensus, too, that this psalm was, broadly speaking, about the Messiah.
And if you connect that to the bigger picture.
Well, you see that Psalm 72 uses language. It references to a righteous king, an era of peace, dominion over the whole earth that really echoes later messianic prophecies. You find similar ideas in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Zechariah.
The same prophetic threads that the New Testament picks up for Jesus.
Precisely. Like think of Zechariah 9.9 to 10, the image of a humble king riding on a donkey. That kind of consistency across different texts suggests this developing tradition of messianic hope rooted in these older passages.
Okay, but here's where it gets maybe even more interesting for me. The source also brings up this idea of a Mosaic prophet, a prophet like Moses. How does that fit in?
Yeah, that's a fascinating layer. It raises this really important question about the different ways people envisioned the Messiah. M. Fitzmyer argued that the Gospel of John subtly uses this Moses theme, even when it's not directly quoting Deuteronomy about a future prophet like Moses.
So it's kind of woven in.
Kind of, yeah. And the fact that John the Baptist seems to deny being the prophet suggests this was a distinct expectation floating around then. Some people apparently thought the Messiah would be a sort of successor to Moses, or maybe even a reincarnation.
So it wasn't just about a king from David's line. There were these other models, too.
Exactly. Messianic thought wasn't monolithic. There wasn't just one job description. And the scrolls themselves, they offer even more diverse pictures.
Like what?
We'll take the fragment 4Q521. That's fragment 521 from Cave 4 at Qumran. This text describes a Messiah whose arrival is marked by some really extraordinary things.
Right.
Cosmic obedience, caring for the pious and the poor, freeing captives, healing the sick, and even raising the dead.
Wow. Raising the dead. That sounds incredibly familiar, like things attributed to Jesus in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke.
The parallels are definitely striking. It suggests there was this shared pool of messianic ideas circulating in early Judaism back then. The things later said about Jesus weren't like totally out of the blue. They tapped into existing hopes.
Right.
And that brings us back to the fourth gospel, John's gospel, with all those different titles for Jesus' logos, prophet, king, son of God, son of man. Our source suggests these very titles actually reflect the wide range of messianic expectations back then.
So people were kind of grappling with who or what the Messiah would actually be.
Yeah, it seems like it. There wasn't one single fixed idea. It was more fluid, more debated.
Okay, so shifting gears a little, the scrolls weren't just about messianic stuff, right? They're also massively important for just understanding the history of the biblical text itself.
Oh, absolutely. There's significance for what we call biblical textual criticism. Basically, studying the text to figure out the original wording, you really can't overstate it. Remember, these scrolls are about 1,000 years older than the Masoretic text.
1,000 years. That changes everything.
It really does. Before the scrolls, we knew about the Masoretic text, the Septuagint, the Samaritan Pentateuch, and those three main older Bibles, all thought to have roots way back. But we were mostly working with medieval copies for our translations.
Right, so these scrolls give us witnesses from centuries earlier.
Much, much earlier witnesses. We can see how texts might have looked long before the versions we relied on were copied.
And the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible source, it actually points out some really interesting textual variations compared to later versions. Can you give us an example that stuck out?
Sure. Take Isaiah 29, verse 5. There are different readings in the Masoretic text, the Septuagint and the big Isaiah scroll from Qumran Cave 1. That's 1Q Isa.
Okay, what's the difference?
It concerns the multitude. The Masoretic text says you're strangers. The Septuagint has the ungodly. But the Qumran scroll, 1Q Isa, reads, your enemies.
Huh. So, strangers, ungodly, enemies. Which one do the experts think is more likely original?
Well, the translators of the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible lean towards your enemies from the Qumran scroll, and their reasoning is pretty neat.
Oh yeah, why?
They point to a parallel phrase later in the same verse, and the multitude of the ruthless ones. The connection between ruthless ones and enemies seems stronger, more consistent poetically than strangers or ungodly.
Okay, so the parallel structure makes enemies fit better.
Exactly. It's a great example of how having these older scrolls gives us clues, like another piece of the puzzle, helping us reconstruct maybe what the text originally said or meant.
That makes a lot of sense. What about the book of Daniel? I remember reading something about different lengths.
That's right. So most of the Daniel scrolls found at Qumran, 7 out of 8, actually had the shorter 12-chapter version. That's the version in Jewish and Protestant Bibles today.
Okay. Not the longer one in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles.
Correct. But, interestingly, even though they didn't find a complete scroll that included the final chapter, chapter 12,
Right.
another scroll, a non-biblical commentary text called the Floraligium, or 4Q174,
Right.
it actually quotes Daniel 12.10.
So even without the full scroll, they knew that part of the text? They were using it?
Seems like it.
Yeah.
And fragments representing every other chapter of Daniel were found. So it suggests the shorter 12-chapter version was likely standard at Qumran, but they were definitely aware of the content of chapter 12.
And the Psalms, that was a huge book for them, wasn't it? Were there variations there too?
Oh, absolutely. The scrolls show the Psalter, the Book of Psalms, existed in different forms at Qumran. Up to about Psalm 89, the order is mostly familiar.
Good. After that.
After Psalm 91 or so, things get pretty different. The arrangements vary. And crucially, some scrolls include psalms that aren't in our traditional 150 psalms at all.
Whoa, like extra Psalms.
Yeah, some were known from other ancient sources, but some were totally new discoveries. It really highlights that the collection of books we call the Bible wasn't necessarily this fixed, closed list back then, not in the same way we think of it.
That really drives home the point about the biblical canon, the official list of books being more fluid back then.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we see linguistic diversity, too. Some Deuteronomy scrolls were written in Paleo-Hebrew, that really ancient script.
Instead of the normal square script.
Right. And even more surprising, they found a fragment of Deuteronomy in Greek 4QLXX2, which tells you some people in the community knew Greek.
Wow.
There was even one Deuteronomy scroll written on papyrus, Pap 6Q Deut, which is unusual since most were on animal skin parchment.
It sounds like Deuteronomy was important, but you also mentioned Leviticus being particularly significant for them. Why Leviticus?
Yeah, the sheer number of Leviticus fragments is really striking. Every single chapter of Leviticus is referenced somewhere in the non-biblical Qumran scrolls. Only Deuteronomy comes close.
So it must have been central to them.
It strongly suggests it was,
Hmm.
especially for this Qumran community, which seems to have had strong priestly connections.
And what was it about Leviticus specifically?
Well, Leviticus puts a huge emphasis on ritual purity, and that was a core, maybe the core concern for the Qumran group. Our source even quotes Leviticus 15.31 about keeping Israel separate from uncleanness so they don't defile the tabernacle.
Ah, the purity rules.
Exactly. Texts like the Temple Scroll, other Qumran writings, they draw heavily on Leviticus for laws about purity rituals, temple service. This focus on purity likely shaped almost everything about their communal life and beliefs.
Okay, so we've hit Messianic ideas, the biblical texts themselves. What about the Qumran community? Their specific beliefs, especially their eschatology, their ideas about the end times.
Well, we can get some clues from their unique language quirks. There's a specific Qumran orthography in language in some texts, like 4Q 491. Fuller spellings of words, longer pronoun endings. It's like their own dialect of Hebrew.
Like identifying markers?
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
Helps identify their specific writings.
And their view of the end of days. Was that straightforward in the scrolls?
Actually, it seems somewhat ambiguous, open to interpretation. The Damascus document, CD1, talks about a 390-year period after the Babylonian exile, calling it the Age of Wrath.
Okay.
But it's not totally clear if that whole period is the Age of Wrath or if the Age of Wrath begins after the 390 years. There's even some wordplay between Age of Wrath and the Last Days, terms that pop up a lot in their commentaries. The Pesharim, they seem really focused on this end time.
So they were trying to figure out when this end would happen, calculating it.
Some scholars think so. They've tried to reconstruct a timeline using that 390-year figure. Maybe it marks the time from the exile until their sect emerged. That could put the teacher of righteousness, their leader, in the late 2nd century BCE and maybe the expected end around, say, 70 BCE.
But that's speculative.
It's definitely debated. These calculations aren't set in stone, and scholars argue about how reliable they are.
And what did they think would happen after this final period, this eschatological war?
Surprisingly, there aren't that many details. The War Scroll, 1QM, mentions the Archangel Michael ruling and Israel having a kingdom on earth, which kind of fits with the book of Daniel. There are mentions of the blessed state of the elect after death, but really clear, definite references to a general resurrection of the dead. They're actually quite rare, and sometimes the texts are fragmented or unclear.
So not a big focus on resurrection like in some other Jewish thought?
It seems less emphasized or maybe understood differently compared to, say, what the Pharisees believed later. It's a point of contrast.
Which is interesting because didn't other writers describe groups like the Essenes differently?
Exactly. Josephus, the historian, said the Essenes, who are often linked to Qumran, believed in the immortality of the soul, not necessarily bodily resurrection. Then Hippolytus, a later Christian writer, said they did believe in resurrection and a final cosmic fire.
So lots of different views floating around back then.
Definitely. Early Judaism was diverse. The Qumran community had its own specific take, even if it's not always crystal clear to us now.
The source also mentioned the prayer of Nabonidus for QPR-Nab. How does that piece fit in?
Ah, yeah, that's a cool example of cultural interaction. It's basically a Jewish retelling of a Babylonian story. It's about a Babylonian king, Nabonidus, who gets sick for 7 years, is healed by a Jewish diviner, and then praises the God of Israel. It has parallels to Nebuchadnezzar's story in Daniel for the illness, the 7 years, acknowledging God, but it's different kings, different details.
So they were taking existing stories and kind of reframing them.
Exactly. Adapting them to fit their own Jewish theological viewpoint. Shows how ideas moved around and were transformed.
We've covered a ton of ground. Before we wrap up this deep dive, were there any other specific biblical bits where the scrolls showed interesting variations?
Yeah, a few quick ones. There's a Deuteronomy scroll in Paleo-Hebrew, 4Q Paleo-Exodum, that has slight variations in the story of Jacob back in Genesis 35.
Little narrative tweaks.
Minor things, yeah. And in Exodus, different fragments show variations in the burning bush story, chapter 3, and also in the plagues narrative in chapters 7 to 11.
So even in really core stories.
It just underscores this textual fluidity back then. Even within the Leviticus scrolls, there are small differences in offering details or purity rules.
And Isaiah, since that big scroll was found, 1Q Isaiah.
Right. Comparing 1Q Isaiah to the later Masoretic text, shows differences in wording, sometimes syntax, in really key prophetic passages, Isaiah 7, 8, 11, 40, 65, 66.
Subtle differences or bigger ones. Sometimes subtle, but they can offer different nuances, different shades of meaning for these foundational prophecies. Studying them helps trace how the text evolved.
Okay, so to try and pull this all together, this deep dive into the Dead Sea Scrolls, I mean, they've given us this absolutely invaluable stash of primary sources from a really pivotal time.
Totally invaluable. They offer this unparalleled glimpse into the incredibly diverse messianic hopes circulating in ancient Judaism. It gives crucial context for how those ideas developed later, in both Judaism and Christianity.
And fundamentally, they've just rewritten our understanding of the Bible's textual history.
Completely. By giving us texts 1,000 years older than we had before, the scrolls show these fascinating variations, different interpretations. It challenges our assumptions about how stable or uniform the Bible was way back then.
So for you listening, you now have this window into that really complex religious world of the Second Temple period, a time just brimming with different ideas, different ways of reading Scripture. Yeah, hopefully you've got a much deeper appreciation for the long, complicated history of the Bible as this living text.
These scrolls really do invite us to rethink what we thought we knew, to explore this rich, varied tapestry of early Jewish thought.
Which brings us maybe to a final thought for you to chew on. Given this incredible diversity of messianic ideas we talked about and all these textual variations, how might these ancient perspectives continue to inform, or maybe challenge, our understanding of religious traditions today?
Yeah.
What does it really mean for a text to be authoritative when we see such clear evidence of its, well, fluidity and ongoing interpretation right from its early history? It's definitely something we're thinking about.